And I'll spend a little time on this because I think it's really cool. I'm not, I haven't read the book, but I heard about an hour of it, and I was, I had that same kind of like whoa kind of thing I kept getting when I was reading the RK book. Um, what he's basically saying with his biohistory, he's got three different values that he's talking about. I thought they were pretty useful too. He's talking about C for CVS, like my pharmacy. C for civilization is a value for civilization. V is a value for vigor, which is basically the intensity of the belief system, the confidence system. And S is for, it's like sustainability, I think. It's basically a longevity kind of thing. I haven't had that chat yet, by the way, but it's coming up on Monday. So here's basically what this Australian researcher was looking at. He was looking into something called epigenetics, which is the ability for certain genes to be selected under certain conditions and so on. And he was talking about a lot of cool things like how scarcity of food in a civilization, which is K-selecting, actually produces like slightly less testosterone. He was talking about testosterone levels in civilization, and that if they're too high, you get this kind of, banditry, you get this kind of sort of relentless raiding and pillaging, and, women are slaves and they're taken off in chains, and, you're broken on the big wheel, and, the highest calling in life is to hear the lamentation of their women as their villages set fire. He says that when you get into some of these situations, that the testosterone level comes down, civilization goes up. But what he's really talking an awful lot about was, like I said, I haven't read it yet, but stuff that really rings is he was talking about how religions, especially monotheistic religions, especially Christianity, although Judaism as well, are basically, when they try to correct children at an early age, he said, again, I'm just kind of scattershot here. Sorry about that. I'll be better when I read the book. But basically what he's saying is a lot of cultures, China, India, and certainly Muslim cultures, raise children so that the infants up until age 4 or 5 or 6 are completely coddled. They're just absolutely, let to run wild. The little baby can't do any wrong. And then all of a sudden, very severe punishments are put in place on them. And his research shows that people like this don't do nearly as well as children who are kind of molded and guided, and he used the word controlled, at an early age, and that actually made a lot of sense to me. He was talking about the peak of Western civilization, C. He said that the peak of vigor, belief in that civilization was in the 1600s, and has been declining steadily since then and precipitously lately. But that when you had Victorian era civilization, European civilization, the British went around the world and they were determined they were doing good for everybody. They were certainly doing good for themselves, but they were bringing, it was the white man's burden. They were bringing civilization to those sitting in darkness. And there was so much vigor, so much V in the system that it really took off. But one of the many things he said in this treatise that I liked so much was so if civilization, if C is your level of civilization, we all know what civilization is. It's science and poetry and art and music, and it's respect for rights and freedom and individuality and all that stuff. He said civilization rises and falls, and there's a lot of variables that make the C factor rise and fall. But the one thing he said that really rang a bell with me was that vigor is much faster. It's a much faster determinant. It can come down much more quickly. And he said when a civilization's vigor goes down, the belief in the civilization, then the civilization level comes down pretty fast. But vigor moves much faster than civilization, and that's exactly what we're seeing now, I think. We're seeing Western civilization that has been losing confidence in itself since probably the 1700s, the catastrophically losing confidence in itself since World War II. And all of this research that he's doing indicates the one thing that RK indicates on an individual level, and that is clearly that that the surest way to destroy a culture is to make it wealthy and secure. This is the mystery that I'd never understood before I read RK. I'm looking back at all these civilizations in the past that have risen and fallen. I've said it before, but I don't think I've ever had it quite as clear as I had it today. Let's just take the Romans, for example. The one thing that never made sense to me before RK and now this biohistory thing is why a civilization would collapse at the moment of its peak success. I mean, once the Roman Empire becomes the Roman Empire and there is essentially no more competition, Carthage has been defeated and the ruins are the ground's sown with salt so nothing will grow there. Once Rome is supreme in the world, you would think that without any competition, without having any significant external enemies, that's when the civilization would just go off. It would just go off exponentially, just take off. To be Romans on the moon. Romans on the moon, 1,000 years ago. And it doesn't happen that way. And it didn't happen with the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Greeks or anybody else for that matter. And what the consistent determinant is wealth. When there's enough wealth, the discipline, and that's a word he used a lot, the discipline necessary to generate wealth starts to disappear, and then it starts to disappear very rapidly. And it can happen in 2 or 3 generations. And again, if you want to come back to the micro on this, it's pretty easy to see it can happen in 2 or 3 generations. Another book that had a profound impact on me is Myth of the Robber Barons, and I've forgotten the guy's name now. He's a professor at Hillhurst College. And what he did was he looked at entrepreneurs, in the 1800s and so on. He talked about market entrepreneurs versus political entrepreneurs, and political entrepreneurs would be people like Fulton, who tried to legislate steamboat routes, and then Commodore Vanderbilt, who basically just said, "Well, we're going to just compete and we're going to lower prices and we're going to do better." And they looked at railroad tycoons and all this other stuff. But the one thing he did say, it's almost parenthetically, but he took a look at Scranton, Pennsylvania, and a bunch of the big steel concerns there, and he looked at a number of families, and he looked at their history. And what he's found repeatedly is that first generation, let's say it's Andrew Carnegie, right? He gets off the boat from Scotland, he's got $24 in his pocket or something, becomes the richest man in the world. I'm not talking about Carnegie specifically, but a number of families, this is the pattern. You have this one incredibly hardworking, disciplined, bright risk taker. They make Burton Folsom, yeah, he's a great guy. Thank you very much, Northcott Michael. So that first generation guy, like a Carnegie or a Vanderbilt or whatever, make a ton of money by offering tremendous value to the people. He doesn't get to point a gun at people and steal their money. Carnegie became rich because he made a tremendous amount of steel, and Vanderbilt became rich because he provided incredible low rates and high quality and safety and stuff. So that first generation person, extremely disciplined, hard worker, competitor, big competitor, makes tons of money. The second generation generally maintains the money, and the third generation squanders the money, and they come right back down, and the money goes back out into the society. It's just basically just pissed away in Ferraris and Ukrainian hookers, and the next thing you know, he's broke, and it's time for somebody else to kind of come along with that. So, all of these things. The nice thing about this is that it all makes sense. It all ties in. It makes intuitive sense. It makes biological sense. It makes historical sense. And I just can't wait to get a hold of this book because, as I said, it's charting, a little larger scale. This idea of a civilization value that goes up and down, and vigor and so on, and child rearing practices. He's talking about the endocrinology of it. He's talking about how, literally he's looking at cortisol levels and looking at, society-wide cortisol levels and testosterone levels and so on. One of the things I've been thinking quite a bit lately as we watch this world of ours just literally coming apart at the seams, and, I don't have to sugarcoat anything for this crew. But American society, especially if you want to isolate where I'm going with this, let's just take the modern liberal university campus, let's take Oberlin College or something like that, is so overly feminized that it's falling apart. Now, a lot of people, a lot of politically correct people, they start huffing. You can see the smoke coming out of their ears. But there's no question that's what it is. There's just too much estrogen there. Now, you can see what a world with too much testosterone looks like because you can just look right at Nazi Germany, and that wasn't a particularly pleasant place to be, but that was 100% masculine values, 100% testosterone, a horrifically over-masculinized society. I think this society is rapidly becoming overly feminine. It is overly feminized, and when you get to the bleeding edge of it, out there in academia, and people like Lena Dunham and that whole crowd, it's simply going to collapse because you can't just do things because they feel good. You can't succeed, and you can't have colleges that don't test students empirically. You just can't. You have no way to measure what people have learned, and they're more and more and more. They're worried less about what they learn and more worried about how they feel about the little that they learned, and all the rest of this stuff. So all I'm talking about is balance. It's not like I don't want to see a overly testosterone-driven, overly masculine society. I don't want to see an overly feminine society. I want one that's in balance. 1960 Mad Men may have been a little more masculinized than we wanted to, but it's a long, long way from Nazi Germany. Somewhere in there is the sweet spot where there's a balance between softness and hardness, a balance between compassion and courage, and a balance between emotional sentimentality and reason, and facing unpleasant facts. And boy, did we ever miss that bus stop? We have gone so far in the other direction. It's just kind of nutty. And all of these symptoms, look, we all know it, right? We know that you can't keep printing money forever. We know that we can't ignore this mass invasion from the south of the border, and now we're going to have 100,000 of these Syrian refugees. And, I saw these guys in the streets of Germany, or Italy, just a couple videos in the last month or two, and I couldn't figure it out at first. I see them, these Muslim mobs would basically rip a parking meter out of the cement, and then they'd use it to just they're bashing the ground with it. I thought, what are these people doing? Are they just determined just to bash where the parking meter used to be? And I realized, no, what they're doing is they're bashing the concrete so they have something to throw. Everywhere they come from, there's, rocks in the streets, because there is no street. There's no paved streets over there, basically. Just rocks everywhere. If you look at Syria, and it's nothing but even the developed parts are ruins. It's just concrete and rebar and badly made crap, and it's just rocks. And these animals don't have anything to throw, so they're basically taking, they're just chipping away the sidewalk and bashing it so they have something they can throw at people. I saw French police cars being run out of these banlieues, these Muslim neighborhoods, and just running away in retreat. And these 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old men are screaming Allahu Akbar, and the French police are hightailing it out of there. Kind of like what we see in American cities, like, Baltimore, let's say. So what does that tell you? What signal does that send to these rioters, either over there or over here, or all these lawless, savages? What message does that tell them when law enforcement runs away from them? Well, it tells them that they're winning, is what it tells them. It makes them more bold and more violent and more evil and harder to take care of. And so, anyway, I just want to just one thing I've been wanting to talk about a little bit on this whole arcade thing is this idea of, I've been watching, I mean, the whole job I do is to try and keep my finger on the pulse of what's actually happening in the world. So I read a lot, and I go to a lot of news stories. And then on the ones I think are really important, I go to the comment section. I'm very curious to know what people are saying about the news stories, and especially given the nature of it. For example, if you see a story on Hillary Clinton's trustworthiness in the New York Times, and 9 out of 10 comments in the New York Times say we don't believe Hillary Clinton, then you've got a pretty good handle on the fact that she's got a real problem. And I've been watching the stories of this, Muslim invasion of Europe, and Europeans are suddenly terrified. They're terrified, and they got a right to be terrified. There's a little bit of Schadenfreude here, in the sense that, we Americans were just nothing but a bunch of knuckle-dragging barbarian savages, nothing but filthy racists, because we're armed to the teeth and because we want a secure border with a fence and checkpoints and IDs. What a miserable, hateful, spiteful, mean-spirited, flinty-hearted, ignorant, racist group of baboons we are. Because we had an immigrant problem, and they didn't. They got to sit in their cafes and enjoy their prosperity and enjoy their security paid for by the American taxpayer and the U.S. Navy and Army and Air Force and Marines and Coast Guard and all that stuff. Now, all of a sudden, they've got an immigrant problem. Now, what do we learn from Europeans? What do they want? They want borders. They want barbed wire. They want They want strict controls. They want to shut down the immigration completely. And there is not a gun for sale in the continent of Europe. They're gone. They're off the shelves. Everybody's buying guns. Just finally once they get a sense of the things that we've been dealing with for a long time here, and it turns out they're exactly like us. So there's a little bit of kind of like, ha-ha kind of thing in there if it wasn't the end of the world. So here's what's interesting to me. Here's what's interesting about this arcade theory. If you think about the fact that prosperity drives people from disciplined, hardworking, competitive K selection to undisciplined, libertine, immoral, unethical, do what's right for me, if you don't get caught then you didn't break the law kind of R selection, then there is no way to stop that wave, because the only way to stop this disease of prosperity is to lose the prosperity. It's in a collapse. And I've come to believe that that is the case, in fact, that it is it's inevitable. And not enough to make you go home and pack up and go to Montana and get your beans and ammo together. But there is something in here. 2 or 3 things in this that's interesting. First of all, if you buy this whole premise, and I do because I think there's just masses of evidence, the one thing I find in the comment streams about these immigrant issues now in Europe is that common everyday Europeans are starting to say things like, we need to buy guns and we have to stop this. I've never seen this before. It's an awakening to the threat, because you can no longer ignore the threat. That's one of the things that's an important distinction between R and K, between liberals and conservatives. Conservatives would rather worry now so that we can be safe later, and liberals would rather worry later so they can feel safe now. This threat sensing part of the brain, the amygdala, mine is firing off every day. I've read enough history and I know enough how these threads are connected to be pretty much terrified every day. I'm alarmed. I'm alarmed at what I'm seeing. I'm alarmed at the breakdown of civic society. I'm alarmed at the toxicity of the American inner cities. I'm alarmed that you can't keep printing money forever. I'm alarmed at the weakening of American strength. I'm alarmed at the growing strength of Russia, China. I'm alarmed at this Muslim invasion. I'm alarmed, and I'm supposed to be alarmed. That is not an unusual or a misfiring. These are alarming things. And I would put myself on the leading edge of people whose eyes are looking for these kind of things. But what's interesting is that if there's a bell curve of people like us, the Stratoloungers out here on the 3 standard deviations to the right of people whose eyes are open, we have a historical background, we know what people are like, we know what happens to civilizations. What's interesting is that bell curve is working its way through the system as these symptoms of this immigration nightmare, this invasion, let's just call it what it is, as the symptoms of these invasions are growing and they become more and more brazen and bold, a bigger piece of that bell curve is starting to get to the point where people are waking up. And you can watch it. You can watch the comments of the Europeans who were the most self-hating, the low on vigor, the no, we don't believe in our civilization, everything is equal and everything, and we probably deserve to die, and blah, 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 blah. Now, this is a complex thing. They don't want that unpleasant realization that things are going to hell, which we have to deal with every day. But because we have the courage to deal with it, we're better equipped to deal with it. The reason liberals put their fingers in the air every time they hear something different is it's physically unpleasant to them to hear an opposing viewpoint. It's physically unpleasant to me too, but I do it. And it's not as unpleasant to me as it is to them because I do it so many times that, my threat level response is now saved for people actually shooting at me or engine failures in single-engine airplanes. That's what gets me motivated now. I don't have to worry about some kid chewing a Pop-Tart in the shape of a pistol. I don't have to panic over that. So what I'm trying to get at is if you take this to be the case, and that liberals are basically avoiding this because they don't want the unpleasantness of, forget about realizing that they're wrong, because they simply can't face the fact that we're heading towards civilizational collapse and potentially a gigantic war for survival. Here's where I'm kind of going with this. For the true believers on the far side of the curve, on the opposite side of the curve for us, they could look out of their windows in their balcony, look down on the street in Oslo or Berlin or Munich or whatever. See, let's take Munich. Let's say you see some blonde German woman being gang raped by a bunch of these Muslim savages down there. And for some people, they would rather ignore that, because to acknowledge it is to admit an even more painful reality than the painful reality of that. Does that make any sense? In other words, what these European progressives are being confronted with now is they're being confronted with this crime wave and this terror that's being introduced by these modern SA savages. And now they have to make a decision. Which one of these do I ignore? If I ignore the rape that's happening right in front of my eyes, the individual act of rape, then I can still pretend that this is just a small group of people and this is a cultural difference and maybe we're dressing a little too provocatively and maybe we ought to look at what we're blah, 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 blah. You can still hang out in your little lifeboat of insulation and not have to face the fact that we're really at war now, that they've been at war with us forever, but we now have to really start thinking about this. And some people will ignore that, and they'll live in their little bubble, and they'll literally close their eyes. Like the woman who was helping with these refugees, a story that broke about a month or two ago. Some woman was working with these immigrant refugees, and she went into one of these neighborhoods, and she was raped by these people, imagine. And then she covered it up, and her colleagues got her to cover it up because to admit what had actually happened, they said, would reflect badly on the immigrant community. In other words, if we report this rape, then people out there will assume that some of these Muslim immigrants are rapists. And we can't have that happen, because even though it's true, if it turns out that we're wrong about them, then we're wrong about everything. And we don't get to live in our little bubble of denial anymore. And I think that's what's going on over there right now. I think more and more Europeans every single day, and Americans too, are waking up to the fact that now the evidence in front of our eyes is so overwhelming that we know that because I made this transition a long time ago and so did all you guys, that they are no longer able to look away from it. It's now the unpleasantness and the emotional stress of seeing what's happening in front of their eyes is now greater than the stress of looking away and pretending that I'm not going to see it. And it's happening in this country too. And I got to tell you, there's a couple more things I want to say about this whole issue, because it's been 2 weeks since we did the show, but I have to tell you, even in that time, things are changing rapidly out there, rapidly changing, and not entirely for the worst. Excuse me, so I have a little remnant of that cough there. Here's some other things I'm beginning to feel. I think Europe is done with Islam. I saw a Pat Condell thing, and he's so clear sometimes, I don't agree with him about everything, but I agree with him about most things. And he's so clear. And he basically talked about Islam, and he said, they demand respect, they demand this, they demand that. And he said, not only have they not done anything to earn that respect, they've done everything possible to make sure they don't get any respect. And he basically said, no, we don't respect you, we don't respect your religion, we don't admire it, we don't like it, we think it's awful, and it's got to go. We don't need it here, you can keep it where you want to, but we're not gonna tolerate it here. And that kind of thing, even 2 years ago, would have been unthinkable. But I think this latest group has been so shocking and so brazen that people are beginning to wake up to it. And I'll tell you something else too. This is the mistake. See, we have so many problems with civilization and decency. There's so many problems that come from this prosperity and this security. But our enemies of civilization have a little cycle of their own. And the one mistake that these people make all the time is they act too early. They shoot too soon. The Japanese are a classic example of this. Japanese believed that Americans were completely decadent and that we wouldn't fight because they'd seen the Roaring '20s and they thought we were soft and weak and couldn't possibly stand up to their martial spirit. And if they'd waited 20 years, they probably would have been right. But they shot too soon. Hitler assumed the same thing about Britain, that it would not fight. He was right about France. He was wrong about Britain. Held him up. And he shot too soon. If he'd waited another 2-3 years, he would have had overwhelming superiority, although the British were starting to catch up. But you get the point, right? They shoot too soon. If this immigration issue, this slow kind of, hudna, this kind of truce and this kind of deceit thing, if they'd let it go for another 20 years, that's not a long time historically. if they'd just basically been kind of polite and kind of quiet and just kept their heads down and done their own thing but not been so brazen about it for another 20 years, the number of Muslim immigrants in Europe would have been much higher as a percentage, and also the number of people capable of resisting them emotionally and mentally would have dwindled to 10%. People who remember World War II, or at least had parents in World War II, because I'll tell you something about these millennials. I know I'm pretty hard on them, and there are millions and millions of exceptions. Maybe half of them are exceptions. But if you think these kids are going to stand up to these guys, if you think that these kids who start to cry when the internet's down for an hour are going to stand up to teenagers who've been raised to slit human throats, that ain't going to happen. So, the reason they shoot too soon is they're convinced by looking at progressives that Western civilization is doomed. And if you look at progressives, it is doomed. They know it. We know it. Everybody knows what weakness is. We know what Obama looks like compared to Putin. We know it. Everybody knows it. We know it, and they know it. And they assume that all of us are as weak as Obama, that all of us are as weak as these university professors, that we're all Lena Dunhams, and we're all, Matt Damons, and nobody's going to fight for anything. And they shoot too soon. They can't wait. They get over anxious, and they fire too early. And then what happens is those actions cause the society go from R back to K, because now there is in fact a threat. There is not an open field of clover forever with no predators. There's a threat. And you got to start thinking a little more K now. The fact that you can't buy a gun in Europe, that all the guns are gone, they're all for sale and sold, is an indication that Europe is going K like that, because there's an actual threat now that they can't ignore. So it can happen pretty fast. Now, I personally think that this is not a breakable cycle, but there are a couple things that are interesting about this. First of all, I think this is the first time in the cycle of civilization, on and off, that we've understood what happened. I think throughout all of these cycles, the people who are preservers of the remnant could look at what was happening and see it happening, but not know why it was happening. I think with these theories, we actually know why. And as I've said 100 times before, this is the first time that common people can talk directly to each other because of the internet. And when I started on this kind of line of thinking 5, 6, 7 years ago, the first thing I realized was that it's the fish rots from the head down. It's the guy in the palace in the silk robe and the silk slippers that sneaks out at midnight and opens the gate of the city to the barbarians, while the common people are on the walls ready to fight and die to protect that city. So we don't have to depend on our elites. We look at Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. We look at these people who want nothing but power, who instead of strengthening the society, want to make the society more dependent on them for their own personal political gain. Same thing with Europe and the European Union, just a bunch of elitists who have basically anesthetized their population in order to get personal political gain. They're opening the doors to these savages in the middle of the night because they have a death wish, but not all of us do. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if this civilizational collapse is inevitable as more and more people become R, as less and less people work, fewer and fewer people work, fewer and fewer people compete, fewer and fewer people have discipline, fewer and fewer people are doing the right thing, more and more people every day are getting onto the welfare wagon, and they're on the cheating wagon, and they're on the, I'm not going to be an idiot, if the money's there, I'm going to take it, that kind of thing. Then you're going to have a collapse. And where I am now is, and I think this is pretty much straightforward, if there's going to be a collapse, and I think there is going to be a collapse, then the sooner the collapse happens, the smaller the collapse will be. The longer it's delayed, the bigger and the deeper it will be. And this level of just raw barbarism may in fact be the mini collapse that makes the big collapse delayed or conceivably even avoided. So look, I don't mean to be overly depressing, but I'm going to be anyway, because reality is reality. It has its own rules, and whether we've got a handle on reality or whether we're accurately looking at reality is a question we'll deal with in a little bit. But if all of this is correct, and all these theories are correct, and all of these trend lines are in fact true, there's no guarantee they are, but it looks that way, then we have to start asking ourselves some questions. And that is not so much how do we prevent this, because it may be unpreventable. The question then becomes, how do we protect and preserve? it against the larger collapse? How do we, it's like the Harry Seldon problem in the Foundation trilogy. If we're going to have this Dark Ages or some kind of general collapse, how do we protect what we love and revere so that, A, it's not as affected, or maybe not affected at all. Well, it's going to be affected, obviously, but not extinguished. And secondly, how can we minimize the damage that's coming? And one of the realizations I had is that, we may be it may be time for us to start thinking not like, Joshua or Moses. Maybe it's time for us to start thinking like Noah. So, when if I ask myself about what kind of things I'd be working on right now, if I had a big piece of paper and a little bit of money behind me, I'd be working on several things. I'd be working on neighborhoods. I'd be working on sustainability. I would definitely establish a currency. I would establish a sound currency. And I've heard all kinds of great things about Bitcoin, but whatever that currency is, it cannot be electronic. I would start to establish a currency. That would be the first thing I would do, something that had value, as gold-based or whatever. And with the common sense resistance, which I might have to move forward, I have to start thinking about things like connecting people, and you can't just deal with online communities anymore, because you have to now start thinking about where are we going to grow some food? What is a defendable position? All this stuff. I don't mean to be so dark as all this, guys, but I know the reason you come into this room is because you feel the same way and you see the same things. And I will probably close this little opening rant of sweetness and light by saying I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's too late. I do think that if Hillary Clinton is elected the next president, then that will be forget about the 4 years, right? Forget about the 4 years of additional damage. If somebody that mendacious and somebody that corrupt can be elected because of identity politics, then forget about the damage that she will do, because Barack Obama is not the problem. Barack Obama is the symptom of the problem. It's the people who elected him that's the problem. If Hillary Clinton is elected, then I think it's time to start thinking very seriously about preserving this in ways that will be preservable. Because if we're going to continue to weaken our military, and if we continue to spend money that we don't have, and if we continue to buy votes and turn people against each other based on how much money they make, then it's time. And I'm not talking about a militia out in the hills, although we probably would need some of that. I'm talking about, what do we do? What do we do? How would we do this? On the other side of that wall back there is a hill, and on the other side of that hill is Los Angeles, and there's 7 million people back there. And there's not one of them in there, I don't think, that can grow their own food. Virtually very few of them are able to defend themselves or even understand what's going on. If all this stuff breaks down, that's not the direction I'm going. I'm going that way. And all I'm saying tonight, because obviously this is stuff that's going to just take a lot of thought and a lot of time and a lot of specialized stuff, but all I'm saying tonight is it's a horrible idea. It's an idea that just fills somebody with despair. But we face it or we don't. And when I talk about feeling things, and feeling is nothing mystical about it. It's just thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny little inputs, tiny little data sets. Comment from this person, somebody says this story over here, something over here, somebody this. I'm telling you, this country is really feeling a level of rage that I've never experienced before, and a level, I can feel it. I can feel that force field of, this is about as much of this crap as we're going to take. I can feel it. And it's not just in this country, it's in the West. People are starting to get to the point when it's like, okay, time to wake up now. Time to wake up. We got real problems here. So now for the final cheery ending, we'll take the questions. There is a world that I don't think is, not only do I not think this is unlikely, if I had to bet, I think it's likely that somebody like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or both of them together or Ben Carr, somebody is going to win this Republican nomination. I don't think it's going to be Donald Trump. And if it turns out that we get a President Ted Cruz and keep the House and Senate, I've heard Ted speak, and I spent, when I was in Arkansas, I was following his father, and his father stayed for my whole speech. I thought it was very flattering, and we talked about it. I talked about an economy. What is an economy? Not economics, just what is an economy? And I heard his father basically saying that if Ted was president, this is what he would do on day one. And one of the things he said that I remembered very clearly was like, if Ted Cruz is elected president, on day one, he's going to issue an executive order that voids all previous executive orders, just voids them. That kind of thing could do it, because it's like everything else. It's a trajectory. It's a trend line, right? You can be in extremely deep trouble, but if all of a sudden the trend lines start to turn around, it gets you a second wind. It gets you a new lease on life. For example, if let's say I'm in incredible tax trouble and I've got all this debt and I've got a certain amount of income and I'm spending, and I have no concern. I'm taking out new credit cards and maxing those things out and blah, 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 blah. Well, pretty much sooner or later, people are going to start to pull the plug, but, I've got a lot of their money, so they've got some skin in the game. If all of a sudden I were to sell off the house, live in a much smaller house, sell off the big car, sell off all the toys, diligently conserve my money and start making payments on a debt, even if they're incredibly tiny payments on the debt, then you can say that this is something we might invest a little extra time into. It buys you a little bit of window. And if you continue those trend lines up and things start getting better, then they get better. Maybe this is as scared as we need to be, because something is changing, folks, right? I mean, you can feel it. Something's changing out there. The world is not as blind to these threats, and it's not just Islam. I was talking about them mostly, but people know that there is just complete lawlessness, that there's no rule of law anymore, that the IRS can target Republicans and not Democrats and get away with it, and Hillary Clinton can lie about top secret emails that are on servers because, number one, she didn't want the Clinton Foundation stuff in there, and number two, she doesn't want anybody to know that the United States of America supplied weapons to Al-Qaeda so that she could have her Libyan victory as a little bit of a gun belt that she can run on for when she was ready to run as president. These things are what's hidden on these servers. This weapons supply to Al-Qaeda to fight ISIS, and we're gonna go in there and we saw, he died kind of swagger nonsense. They didn't get a UN approval like Bush did. They didn't get congressional approval like Bush did. All this stuff is out there. They're running arms through Benghazi, and that's why they're trying to cover it up. If it turns out that you win this election, and a guy like Ted Cruz, I think, is uniquely qualified for this because he understands the Constitution, loves the Constitution, and is from a family that has dealt with these kind of tyrants and lawlessness in Cuba, then things can go that way as fast. So let's get out there and win this election. We got 1 year to do it, and that's basically what I'm going to be doing with the next year. I'm going to be fighting against Hillary Clinton and this crowd as hard as I possibly can, and at the same time, in here, in the Stratosphere Lounge, we're going to be starting to talk about what do we do if it turns out that we can't stop them. That's a reasonable position. You can't look at these situations. You can't look at 18, 19, 20 trillion dollars in debt, and China's economy and all of their money. It's nothing there. It's fraud. There comes a point when you begin to realize, you're trying to sit on the brakes, you're trying to steer through traffic, you're trying to avoid the obstacles. Comes a point when you realize in a crash, I'm going to hit this thing. And it's funny how that works, because your brain starts working so fast in that crisis. I'm going to hit this thing, and it's no longer a question of how do I get out of this accident. I'm going to be in an accident. How do I mitigate this accident? Same thing for aviation things, by the way. And try and save the airplane, going to try and make a safe landing. Now, every now and then, you're going to go into the trees or whatever, and then it's like, okay, how do I point the nose between the trees so that I shear the wings off and slow this thing down so we can get out and walk away? And by the way, I see up there, Wes Walker it says I'm a Canuck. We're terribly wrecked up here with the last election. Yeah, that's right. You elected Trudeau in Canada after all the progress you made in Canada, where you turned Canada into a much freer country than America. and a much more sound economy than America, and you do all these things that these conservatives did in Canada, and then immediately you throw it away with a Trudeau, with a 30-year-old Trudeau. It's not just us. It's them. But I do feel, I really want to just, I keep saying I'm going to close, I really genuinely, honestly feel that the tide of perception has turned, that more people now are aware that we cannot keep doing this than are not aware. So it just needs somebody to say it. It just needs that emperor's new clothes. It needs somebody to say what's true. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. And hopefully with your support, that's what we'll keep doing. And that's so much for my opening remarks for the day. Excuse me.